Have you ever been punished for saving a life? She walked out of the hospital in tears, fired for refusing to let a patient die. Her scrubs were still damp from washing her hands after the procedure that proved her right. But the administrators didn't care about right or wrong. They cared about protocol. So they took her badge, escorted her out, and left her walking home alone in the dark. What they didn't know was that 40 miles away, soldiers were dying. And in less than 20 minutes, 2 Apache helicopters would land in the street behind her, and armed soldiers would be shouting her name. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories about people who do what's right, even when the system punishes them, consider subscribing. She had no idea her worst night was about to become someone else's only hope. The emergency room on a Friday night in late autumn carried the particular weight of exhaustion that comes only after the 12th hour of a shift that should have ended 3 hours earlier. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently above the nursing station, casting uneven shadows across the tile floor, still marked with scuff marks from when the last gurney had been rushed through. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, and somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm, counting out the seconds like a metronome no one was listening to anymore. Isolde Calloway moved through the chaos with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of knowing exactly where she needed to be before anyone else realized it mattered. She was in her mid-30s, average height, dark hair pulled back in a knot that had loosened over the course of the shift, but still held. Her scrubs were rumpled, her hands steady. She didn't raise her voice or gesture broadly. She simply moved, adjusted, anticipated. A glance at a monitor told her the IV rate needed changing. A touch to a patient's wrist told her the sedation was wearing off too quickly. She spoke in low tones to the newer nurses, correcting without criticizing, guiding without hovering. But there was tension in the room that had nothing to do with the patients. It followed her like a shadow, subtle but persistent. At the nurses' station, Mr. Vennick stood with a clipboard pressed against his chest, his expression carefully neutral in the way that people adopt when they have already decided something, but have not yet said it aloud. He was senior administration, the kind of man who wore a tie even on night shifts and kept a pen clipped to his pocket as if it were a badge of authority. He had been watching Isolde for weeks now, making notes, asking questions about protocol adherence, flagging minor inconsistencies in charting. Nothing overt, nothing you could challenge directly, just pressure, steady and relentless. Isolde knew he was there. She had known for days. But she also knew that acknowledging it would give him the opening he wanted, so she kept moving, kept working, kept her focus on the patients who needed her more than she needed to defend herself. The call came in at 11:53, trauma incoming, middle-aged male, severe chest pain, vitals unstable. The paramedics had started an IV line and administered nitroglycerin en route, but the pain had not subsided. Blood pressure was elevated, heart rate erratic. The patient was conscious but struggling, his face pale and sheened with sweat. Dr. Halvard Gruen arrived from the cardiac wing within minutes. He was polished, composed, the kind of surgeon who spoke in measured tones and expected deference. He reviewed the chart quickly, listened to the patient's breath sounds, checked the monitor readouts, and made his decision with the kind of confidence that came from years of being right more often than not. Stabilize and transfer to the downtown cardiac unit. Standard protocol for suspected myocardial infarction. Low risk, high reward. The patient would be in better hands there. Isolde stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes on the patient rather than the chart. She watched the way his breathing had shifted, shallow and guarded on the left side. She noted the faint mottling along his neck and shoulders, the way his pulse felt thready beneath her fingertips when she checked his wrist. She had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize it. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. This is not cardiac. It is a dissecting aneurysm. If we move him, he dies. The room went quiet. The younger nurses glanced at each other, uncertain. One of the attending residents looked down at his shoes. Dr. Gruen turned slowly, his expression unreadable, and regarded her for a long moment. You are asking me to change my diagnosis based on what exactly? A hunch? Isolde held his gaze. Based on the presentation, the guarded breathing, the asymmetric pulses, the skin changes. I am asking you to order a CT angiogram before we transfer. Dr. Gruen's jaw tightened. You are asking me? I do not take orders from nurses. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Isolde did not flinch. Then I am refusing the transfer under patient advocacy protocol. It was the nuclear option. The kind of move that ended careers if you were wrong. Protocol allowed nurses to refuse participation in care they believed endangered a patient. But invoking it openly, in front of witnesses, against a senior attending physician, was professional suicide. Dr. Gruen turned to the charge nurse, his voice clipped and cold. Document this. Isolde did not move. She kept her hand on the patient's wrist, feeling the pulse beneath her fingers, steady enough for now, but fragile. She knew what she was risking. She also knew what would happen if she did nothing. The charge nurse hesitated, then picked up a pen. The room remained silent. Isolde looked at the imaging tech standing near the door. I need a CT angio. Now. The tech glanced at Dr. Gruen, then back at Isolde. She gave the smallest nod. The tech swallowed, then moved toward the patient's bed. Dr. Gruen did not stop him. He simply stood there, arms crossed, watching. The scan took 11 minutes. Isolde stayed with the patient, adjusting his IV, monitoring his vitals, speaking to him in low, reassuring tones. The patient's wife had arrived and stood just outside the room, her hands pressed against the glass, her face pale. Isolde met her eyes once, briefly, and nodded. When the imaging results came back, they appeared on the monitor in the radiology bay. Dr. Gruen was already there. He said nothing as the scan loaded. The aorta was visible in cross-section, the dissection clear and unmistakable. A massive tear in the vessel wall, blood pooling between the layers, moments from complete rupture. Dr. Gruen stared at the screen. Then he turned and walked back into the ER without a word. He ordered an emergency surgical team. The patient was prepped and rushed to the operating room within minutes. Isolde stood alone in the hallway, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was beginning to drain. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and took a slow breath. The patient would survive. The surgery would be difficult, but he would survive. She had made the right call. But when she opened her eyes, Mr. Vennick was standing at the end of the hall, phone pressed to his ear, his gaze locked on her. 20 minutes later, Isolde was pulled into a small administrative office on the second floor. It was windowless, the kind of room used for difficult conversations that needed to happen away from patients and staff. Mr. Vennick was already seated, along with another administrator she recognized but had never spoken to. Dr. Gruen entered last, closing the door behind him. Mr. Vennick set his clipboard on the desk and folded his hands. You violated direct orders from an attending physician. You undermined hospital hierarchy in front of staff and patients. This is insubordination. Isolde remained standing. The patient had a dissecting aneurysm. If we had transferred him, he would have died. The administrator leaned forward. The patient survived, but that is not the point. You do not get to override doctors. You do not get to make those calls. I made the right call. Mr. Vennick's expression did not change. That is not your job. Silence filled the room. Isolde could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. She looked at Dr. Gruen. He was staring at the wall, his face expressionless. Mr. Vennick stood. You are terminated, effective immediately. The words landed like a physical blow. Isolde's breath caught, but she did not speak. She had known this was coming, had felt it building for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way she had not been prepared for. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her badge. She set it on the desk, then removed her ID lanyard and placed it beside the badge. Her hands were steady now, though something inside her felt as if it were breaking apart slowly, piece by piece. No one met her eyes as she turned and walked toward the door. The hallway outside was empty. The ER continued its work below, monitors beeping, patients waiting, nurses moving through their routines. But Isolde was no longer part of it. She walked down the stairs and out through the side exit, the one that staff used when they did not want to be seen. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain that had not yet fallen. The hospital's lights glowed behind her, but she did not look back. She began walking. The road stretched ahead, quiet and dark, lined with trees whose branches swayed gently in the wind. She pulled out her phone, stared at the screen for a moment, then put it away. There was no one to call, No one who would understand what had just happened, or why it mattered, or what it meant. The tears came slowly at first, then harder. She kept walking, her scrubs still damp from where she had washed her hands after checking the patient's IVs one last time. She had saved a life tonight. She had done exactly what she was trained to do, what she had spent years learning how to do, and it had cost her everything. She did not hear the sound at first. It was distant, a low mechanical hum that could have been anything. But as she walked, it grew louder, closer, until it was no longer background noise, but something immediate and impossible to ignore. She stopped and looked up. The sky above her was dark, the stars hidden behind a thin layer of clouds. But the sound was unmistakable now. Rotor blades, heavy, rhythmic, cutting through the night air with a force that made the trees tremble. 40 miles to the northeast, in a secured military training zone, flames were still burning. The transport vehicle had rolled 3 times before coming to rest on its side, metal twisted and crumpled, fuel leaking into the dirt. 5 soldiers had been inside. 3 were conscious, 2 were not. The field medics had moved fast, applying tourniquets, securing airways, stabilizing fractures, doing everything they had been trained to do. But one of the injured was Major Peyton Reese, a decorated officer with command-level clearance, and his injury was beyond what any of them could manage in the field. A tension pneumothorax complicated by a collapsed bronchus. Rare, time-sensitive, fatal if not treated correctly within minutes. Sergeant Loomis knelt beside the major, his hands covered in blood, his radio pressed to his ear. "We need a trauma specialist, now. We have maybe 20 minutes. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "There is one. Civilian, regional hospital. Stand by." At the forward operating base, Colonel Tavish Embry was already pulling records. He needed someone with trauma credentials, field experience, and proximity. Someone who could perform under pressure without hesitation. One name appeared repeatedly in the incident reports from 3 years prior. A mass casualty event during a chemical plant explosion, 14 critical patients, 0 deaths. The lead trauma nurse on record was Isolde Calloway. Her name appeared again in field medic debrief notes. One of them had written, "She taught us more in 2 hours than we learned in 6 months of training." Colonel Embry picked up the phone. "Find her. I do not care how. We need her in the field in 30 minutes. 2 Apache helicopters were diverted mid-flight and given new coordinates. They descended rapidly, their landing lights cutting through the darkness, and touched down near the regional hospital with rotors still spinning. Soldiers deployed immediately, moving with precision toward the main entrance. Mr. Vennick was paged to the front desk. He arrived confused, still holding the clipboard he had been carrying when Isolde left. A soldier stood waiting, rifle slung across his chest, his expression unreadable. "We are looking for Isolde Calloway. Trauma nurse. Where is she?" Mr. Vennick blinked. "She is not on duty, then find her." Security footage was pulled. Mr. Vennick's face drained of color as he watched the recording. Isolde, badge removed, walking out through the side exit less than an hour earlier. Where did she go? She left. On foot. The soldier radioed immediately. The Apaches lifted off, their searchlights sweeping across the roads below. Isolde was still walking when she heard the sound directly above her. She looked up and saw them, 2 massive helicopters descending toward the road ahead, their rotors whipping the air into a frenzy. They touched down in a secured intersection, landing lights blazing, and soldiers jumped out before the skids had fully settled. One of them spotted her and began running in her direction. Isolde Calloway. She stopped, frozen, her mind unable to process what was happening. "Yes? We need you. Now. Lives depend on it." She did not understand. She barely heard him, over the roar of the engines. But something in his voice, something in the urgency of his movements, cut through the confusion. She ran toward the helicopter. If you have ever felt invisible in a place that should have valued you most, share your story in the comments. And if you believe competence should matter more than compliance, consider subscribing, because sometimes the people who are cast aside are the same ones the world cannot afford to lose. The interior of the Apache was cramped, utilitarian, and louder than anything Isolde had ever experienced. The vibration from the rotors moved through the metal frame and into her bones, a relentless hum that made it impossible to think in straight lines. She was strapped into a jump seat, a headset pressed over her ears, the muffled roar of the engines replaced by the sharp clarity of radio chatter, and the voice of the crew chief seated across from her. He was young, maybe mid-20s, his face streaked with dust and his hands moving, constantly as he checked equipment, adjusted straps, and maintained contact with the ground team. He spoke quickly, his words clipped and direct. Officer down. Rare trauma presentation. Field conditions. You have approximately 15 minutes from touchdown to stabilization. Isolde's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, willing them to stop, but the adrenaline was still coursing through her system from the events at the hospital. And now it had nowhere to go, except into the tight coil of tension building in her chest. She forced herself to focus on the crew chief's words, to process what he was saying, to shift her mind away from the humiliation of an hour ago and into the space where she could function. What is his oxygen saturation? The crew chief relayed the question through his radio. A moment later, the answer came back. 82 and dropping. Isolde closed her eyes. Then we are already late. The crew chief studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You have done this before. It was not a question. Isolde opened her eyes and met his gaze. Yes. He nodded once, then returned his attention to the radio. The helicopter banked sharply to the left, and through the small window beside her, Isolde caught a glimpse of the landscape below. Dark fields, scattered lights from distant homes, the faint glow of a town she did not recognize. Everything was moving too fast, the world reduced to fragments of light and shadow, and somewhere beneath it all was a man she had never met, whose life now depended entirely on whether she could do in the field what she had been fired for doing in a hospital. She thought about the patient from earlier, the man with the dissecting aneurysm. By now he would be in surgery, the tear in his aorta being repaired by skilled hands under controlled conditions. He would survive because she had refused to let protocol dictate his fate. And yet, the system had punished her for it, had stripped her of her badge and sent her out into the night as if her judgment meant nothing. But here, in this helicopter, her judgment was the only thing that mattered. The crew chief's voice cut through her thoughts. 2 minutes to touchdown. Be ready. Isolde straightened in her seat, her hands steadying now as the shift occurred inside her. The fear, the uncertainty, the lingering ache of betrayal, all of it folded away into a compartment she would deal with later. Right now, there was only the work. She ran through the procedure in her mind, visualizing each step, anticipating complications, preparing herself for the chaos she was about to walk into. The Apache descended sharply, the landing rougher than she expected, and the moment the skids touched the ground, the door slid open. Isolde unbuckled herself and jumped out before the crew chief could assist her. The air outside was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burnt fuel. Emergency floodlights had been set up in a wide perimeter, casting harsh shadows across the triage zone, where soldiers moved with controlled urgency. Isolde ran toward the center of the activity, her scrubs immediately recognizable in the sea of camouflage. A medic saw her coming and pointed toward a figure lying on a stretcher, surrounded by kneeling personnel. She pushed through without hesitation and dropped to her knees beside the patient. Major Peyton Reese was in his late 40s, his face pale and slicked with sweat, his breathing shallow and labored. His uniform had been cut away, exposing his chest where improvised bandaging had been applied. One of the medics was manually bagging him, squeezing oxygen into his lungs in steady rhythm. But his color was wrong. His lips were tinged with blue, and his oxygen saturation, displayed on a portable monitor clipped to his belt, read 79. Isolde placed her hand on his chest, feeling for asymmetry in the rise and fall. His left side was barely moving. She listened to his breath sounds with a stethoscope one of the medics handed her without being asked. Absent on the left, hyperresonant to percussion. The diagnosis was immediate and unambiguous. 14-gauge needle, scalpel, airway kit, move. The medics responded instantly, pulling equipment from packs and laying it out on a sterile drape beside her. There was no hesitation, no questioning. They had been told she was coming, and they trusted that she knew what she was doing. Isolde palpated the landmarks on the major's chest, identifying the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. She took the needle from the medic's hand, positioned it carefully, and advanced it through the skin and into the pleural space in one smooth motion. There was a hiss of pressurized air escaping, immediate and unmistakable. The major's chest rose slightly. his oxygen saturation ticking upward to 84, then 87. It was not enough. The needle decompression had bought them time, but the underlying injury required more than a temporary fix. "I need a surgical airway. Hold the light steady and do not move." One of the medics positioned a flashlight directly over the major's throat. Isolde palpated the cricothyroid membrane, a small depression between the thyroid and cricoid cartilages, and marked the spot mentally. She took the scalpel, made a horizontal incision through the skin, and worked quickly through the underlying tissue until she reached the membrane itself. A second incision, this one vertical, opened the airway. She inserted a tracheostomy tube, secured it with ties, and connected it to the oxygen supply. The major gasped, a raw, desperate sound, and his oxygen saturation climbed rapidly. 91, 94, 97. His color began to return, the blue fading from his lips, his chest rising and falling, with more symmetry now. The medics around her exhaled collectively. One of them whispered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Another reached out and squeezed Isolde's shoulder briefly before returning to work on the other casualties. Isolde sat back on her heels, her hands covered in blood, her scrubs soaked through with sweat and fluids. She stared at the major for a moment, watching the monitor, watching his chest, making sure the airway was stable and the oxygen levels were holding. Then she stood and moved to the next patient. There were 4 others, all with varying degrees of injury. A fractured femur that had been splinted but needed surgical fixation. A head injury with altered mental status that required close monitoring. 2 with moderate blood loss from lacerations and shrapnel wounds. Isolde worked through them methodically, prioritizing, stabilizing, coordinating with the medics to prepare them for evacuation. She spoke in short, clear directives, and the medics responded with the kind of efficiency that came from training and trust. Within 20 minutes, all 5 casualties were loaded onto evacuation helicopters and airborne. The triage zone began to empty, the floodlights casting long shadows across the now quiet field. Isolde walked to the edge of the perimeter and knelt beside a water canteen someone had left on the ground. She opened it and poured water over her hands, washing away the blood in slow, deliberate movements. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it was different. This time it was the aftershock of adrenaline fading, the body's response to having pushed itself beyond normal limits and now trying to recalibrate. She splashed water on her face, the cold shock of it grounding her, pulling her back into the present moment. Footsteps approached from behind. She did not turn. "You just saved 4 lives. Maybe 5. The voice belonged to Colonel Tavish Embry. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. He stopped a few feet away from her, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady. Isolde did not respond. Immediately, she stared at her hands, at the water dripping from her fingers, at the faint tremor that still had not subsided. "We will make sure your hospital knows." Isolde looked up at him then, her expression unreadable. "They fired me tonight." The colonel's jaw tightened. For what? For doing exactly what I just did. Silence settled between them, heavy and deliberate. The colonel did not ask for clarification. He did not offer platitudes or reassurances. He simply nodded once, pulled out his phone, and walked a short distance away to make a call. Isolde stood and looked back at the triage zone, the blood-stained stretchers, the discarded packaging from medical supplies, the floodlights now being dismantled by soldiers who moved with the same precision they had brought to every other task tonight. She had been here less than an hour, and in that time, she had done more to validate her worth than 15 years of hospital service had ever acknowledged. But the weight of what had happened earlier still pressed against her chest, a reminder that competence alone was not enough when the people in power decided it was not. The colonel returned, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I just spoke with the Department of Defense liaison. They will be contacting your hospital administration within the hour. What happened tonight will be documented, and your actions will be formally recognized." Isolde nodded, but she felt nothing. Recognition was hollow when it came from strangers, while the people who should have known better had already made their judgment. The colonel studied her for a moment, then spoke again, his tone softer now. "You did not hesitate, not once. Most civilians would have. I am not most civilians." "No, you are not." He gestured toward one of the remaining helicopters. We can take you back to the hospital or to your home. Your choice." Isolde looked at the helicopter, then back at the field. She thought about walking into that hospital again, facing the same administrators who had dismissed her, the same doctors who had stood by and said nothing. She thought about going home, to an empty apartment where she would sit alone and try to process what had just happened. Take me home. The flight back was quieter. The crew chief did not speak, and Isolde was grateful for the silence. She stared out the window at the dark landscape below, the scattered lights of towns and cities passing beneath them like distant constellations. Somewhere down there, people were sleeping, unaware that lives had been saved tonight, that decisions had been made in seconds that would ripple outward in ways they would never see. When the helicopter landed near her apartment building, Isolde thanked the crew and stepped out into the cool night air. The rotors spun down gradually, the noise fading into the background as the aircraft powered off. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, still wearing her blood-stained scrubs, and watched as the helicopter lifted off, again, and disappeared into the darkness. Her apartment was on the third floor of a modest building on the edge of town. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last, and unlocked the door with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The interior was dark and quiet, untouched since she had left for her shift more than 14 hours earlier. She dropped her keys on the counter, walked to the bathroom, and turned on the shower. She stood under the hot water for a long time, washing away the blood and sweat and exhaustion, watching the water run red and then clear as it circled the drain. When she finally stepped out, she wrapped herself in a towel and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up and saw several missed calls, all from numbers she did not recognize. There were voicemails, but she did not listen to them. She set the phone down and lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. Sleep did not come easily. The next morning, Mr. Vennick's phone rang at 8:14. He answered it groggily, still half asleep, and listened as a calm, professional voice on the other end identified itself as a Department of Defense liaison. The conversation was brief, formal, and devastatingly clear. The hospital's decision to terminate Isolde Calloway had been noted. Her actions the previous night had directly resulted in the survival of 5 military personnel, including a senior officer. The liaison informed Mr. Vennick that a formal commendation would be issued, and that the hospital administration would be expected to cooperate fully with any inquiries. Mr. Vennick ended the call and sat on the edge of his bed, his face pale. Within an hour, he had contacted the hospital's board of directors. An emergency meeting was convened by noon. The board reviewed the situation quickly. The implications were immediate and unavoidable. Terminating a nurse who had just been credited with saving multiple lives under extraordinary circumstances was a public relations disaster waiting to happen. Worse, it raised questions about the hospital's judgment, its protocols, and its treatment of competent staff. A carefully worded statement was drafted. Lawyers reviewed it. Communication staff prepared talking points. And then someone was assigned to call Isolde and inform her that the termination had been reconsidered. The call went unanswered. They tried again. Still nothing. By late afternoon, panic was beginning to set in. Isolde spent the day in her apartment, ignoring her phone, ignoring the knocks at her door, ignoring the world outside. She sat by the window and watched the street below, the rhythm of daily life continuing as if nothing had changed. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. A child rode a bicycle in slow, uneven circles. She thought about the major, about whether he had survived the surgery, about the other soldiers and whether they were recovering. She thought about the patient from the night before, the man with the dissecting aneurysm, and wondered if anyone had told him what had happened, if he knew that the decision to save his life had cost her everything. And she thought about what came next, because despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the betrayal and the anger, she was still a nurse. It was not something she could turn off. It was woven into who she was, into how she understood the world and her place in it. On the 5th day, Isolde received a call from Colonel Embry. He asked if they could meet. She agreed. They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The colonel arrived in civilian clothes, and they sat outside at a table shaded by an umbrella. He ordered coffee. Isolde ordered tea. "The hospital has been trying to reach you. I know. They want to reverse the termination." "I know." The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What do you want?" Isolde wrapped her hands around the teacup. feeling the warmth seep into her palms. I want to go back, but not under the same conditions. The colonel nodded slowly. Then let us make sure you do not have to. He pulled a folder from the bag beside him and slid it across the table. Inside was a formal commendation from the Department of Defense, signed by senior officials, detailing her actions and their impact. Attached to it was a consulting contract, drafted by military legal counsel, outlining terms that granted her full clinical autonomy, veto authority on patient care decisions, and independent contractor status. You do not have to accept this, but if you do, they will have no leverage over you. You will be working with them, not for them. Isolde opened the folder and read through the documents slowly. When she finished, she looked up at the colonel. Why are you doing this? Because people like you should not be punished for being good at what you do. She closed the folder and set it on the table. Then, let us make sure they understand that. 2 days later, Isolde walked through the main entrance of the regional hospital. She was not wearing scrubs. She was dressed professionally, carrying the folder under one arm. And beside her was the military liaison officer who had coordinated everything with Colonel Embry. Mr. Vennick was waiting in the lobby. He had prepared an apology, rehearsed it multiple times, and was ready to deliver it with as much sincerity as he could muster. But Isolde walked past him without a glance, heading directly toward the elevator. The conference room on the 3rd floor was filled with senior hospital leadership. The board chairman, the chief medical officer, the director of nursing, and several attorneys. They stood when Isolde entered, but she did not wait for pleasantries. She sat at the head of the table, opened the folder, and slid the documents across to the chairman. I am not coming back as staff. I am coming back as an independent trauma consultant, with full clinical autonomy and veto authority on patient transfers, military recommendation included. The room was silent. The chairman picked up the documents and read through them carefully. The attorneys leaned in, whispering among themselves. The chief medical officer stared at Isolde, his expression caught between disbelief and resignation. Finally, the chairman set the documents down and looked at Isolde. We accept. Isolde stood, nodded once, and walked out of the room. The liaison officer followed her into the hallway. That evening, Isolde returned to the emergency room floor. She walked through the double doors and into the familiar chaos of beeping monitors, urgent voices, and the hum of controlled urgency. The staff saw her. A younger nurse named Marin, who had been present the night Isolde was fired, froze mid-step. You are back? Isolde met her gaze. I am back. No grand entrance, no triumphant speech. Just a quiet return to the place where she belonged. She picked up a chart from the nurse's station, scanned the patient, information, and moved toward the exam room. The shift had begun. And this time, no one would take it from her. If someone you know has ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, leave a comment. And if stories like this remind you why competence and courage matter, subscribing helps us share more of them. The emergency room on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks later carried the same weight of controlled chaos that Isolde had navigated for years, but the rhythm had changed in ways that were subtle and unmistakable. She moved through the space with the same quiet efficiency she always had. But now, when she called for a test or questioned a diagnosis, the response was immediate and unquestioned. The younger nurses watched her with something close to reverence. The attending physicians consulted her before making transfer decisions. And Mr. Vennick, when he appeared at all, kept his clipboard close to his chest and his distance carefully measured. Isolde did not take satisfaction in the shift. She simply worked. The patient still needed care, the monitors still beeped, and the underlying truth remained the same. Lives depended on competence, not politics. The system had tried to forget that, and she had reminded them in a way they could not ignore. But there were moments, brief and fleeting, when the memory of that night surfaced. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the darkness, the weight of a scalpel in her hand under a flashlight beam, the look on the medic's face when the major's oxygen saturation climbed back into safe range. Those moments stayed with her, not as triumphs, but as reminders of why she had chosen this work in the first place. Tonight, the ER was busy but manageable. A child with a suspected appendicitis had been admitted and was being prepped for imaging. An elderly man with pneumonia was being stabilized before transfer to the ICU. A teenager with a broken wrist sat in the waiting area, his mother beside him, filling out paperwork, routine cases handled with routine precision. Isolde was reviewing labs at the nurse's station when Marion approached, a chart in her hand and uncertainty in her expression. There is a patient in Bay 4, chest pain, elevated troponin, but the EKG is inconsistent. Dr. Gruen wants to transfer to cardiac. Isolde looked up. Show me. They walked together to Bay 4, where a woman in her early 60s lay on a gurney, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Dr. Gruen stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing the monitor readouts with the same measured confidence he had always carried. He glanced at Isolde when she entered, but said nothing. Isolde moved to the patient's side and introduced herself quietly. She placed her hand on the woman's wrist, feeling for the pulse, then listened to her breath sounds with a stethoscope. She palpated the abdomen, checked for asymmetry, and asked a series of questions in a calm, unhurried tone. The woman answered in fragments, her voice strained. Isolde turned to Bamarin. I need a CT angio. Dr. Gruen straightened, his expression unreadable. The EKG suggests acute coronary syndrome. The protocol is transfer. Isolde met his gaze evenly. The presentation suggests dissection. The EKG is a distraction. If we transfer her, she dies. The room went still. Marin glanced between them, her hands tightening on the chart. Dr. Gruen did not move. The silence stretched, taut and deliberate. Then Dr. Gruen nodded once. Order the scan. Isolde turned to Marin, who immediately moved toward the phone to coordinate with radiology. The imaging tech arrived within minutes, and the patient was wheeled down the corridor toward the CT suite. Isolde walked alongside the gurney, her hand resting lightly on the rail, speaking in low tones to the woman who gripped her other hand with surprising strength. 14 minutes later, the results appeared on the monitor in the radiology bay. Another dissecting aneurysm, this one in the descending aorta, the tear clearly visible in the contrast-enhanced images. The radiologist confirmed what Isolde had already known, and within moments, the surgical team was paged. The patient was prepped, consents were signed, and within the hour she was in the operating room, where skilled hands worked to repair the damage before it became catastrophic. Dr. Gruen found Isolde in the hallway afterward. He stood a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his white coat, his expression tired in a way that went beyond the physical demands of the shift. You were right. Again. Isolde did not respond immediately. She was thinking about the patient, about the narrow margin between survival and catastrophe, about how many times she had seen that margin crossed because someone refused to listen. It is not about being right. It is about being willing to look. Dr. Gruen studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. I should have listened the first time. Isolde held his gaze. Yes, you should have. He did not argue. He did not make excuses. He simply turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, his shoulders slightly hunched, the weight of his own reckoning visible in the way he moved. Isolde watched him go, then returned her attention to the patient board, scanning for the next case that needed her assessment. The shift ended just after midnight. Isolde changed out of her scrubs in the staff locker room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the sound of water running in the showers mingling with the distant beep of monitors from the emergency department. She folded her scrubs carefully and placed them in her locker, then pulled on jeans and a sweater. The night air would be cool, and she had no desire to be cold on the walk to her car. As she stepped out into the parking lot, she paused for a moment, looking back at the hospital. The building was lit from within, windows glowing against the dark sky, a beacon for anyone who needed help. She had spent so many years walking through those doors, carrying the weight of responsibility and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was doing work that mattered. And now, after everything that had happened, she was still here. Not because she had been allowed to return, but because she had earned the right to stay on her own terms. The following week, Colonel Embry called. His voice was calm and professional, but there was an undercurrent of warmth that suggested this was more than just a formal request. He asked if Isolde would be willing to conduct a training session for field medics at the forward operating base. The session would focus on high-pressure trauma management, decision-making under uncertainty, and field adaptations of hospital protocols. It would be a full day, intensive, and entirely voluntary. Isolde accepted without hesitation. The base was an hour's drive north, a sprawling complex of low buildings and open training fields surrounded by fencing and security checkpoints. Isolde arrived early in the morning, her credentials verified at the gate by a young soldier who saluted her with unexpected formality. She was escorted through the compound by a liaison officer who explained the layout as they walked, pointing out the medical facilities, the training areas, and the administrative buildings that housed command staff. The conference room where the training would take place was large and utilitarian, with rows of tables arranged in a semicircle facing a whiteboard and projection screen. 30 medics sat waiting, their uniforms clean and pressed, their expressions attentive. They ranged in age from early 20s to mid-40s, and their eyes tracked Isolde as she entered, taking her measure in the way that soldiers do when evaluating someone new. Colonel Embry introduced her briefly, outlining her credentials and the events of 3 weeks prior without unnecessary embellishment. He spoke with the kind of authority that commanded attention, and when he finished, he stepped aside and gestured for Isolde to begin. She did not use slides or prepared notes. She had learned long ago that the best teaching came from direct engagement, from responding to questions and challenges in real time rather than following a script. She began by asking the medics to describe the most difficult trauma case they had encountered, and as they spoke, she listened carefully, identifying patterns, recognizing common mistakes, and noting areas where training could be improved. Then she moved into case studies, walking them through scenarios that mirrored the kind of high-pressure decisions they would face in the field. She demonstrated needle decompression on a training dummy, her movements precise and deliberate, explaining each step as she worked. She walked them through surgical airway placement, showing them how to identify landmarks under poor lighting conditions, how to maintain sterility when resources were limited, and how to manage complications when things went wrong. The medics asked questions, sharp and specific, and Isolde answered them without hesitation. She corrected assumptions, challenged protocols that did not account for field realities, and pushed them to think beyond the checklist. She emphasized the importance of the pattern recognition, of trusting their training while remaining flexible enough to adapt when circumstances demanded it. By midday, the room had shifted from passive attention to active engagement. The medics were leaning forward, taking notes, asking follow-up questions, debating among themselves about the best approaches to various scenarios. Isolde moved among them, stopping at each table to review their technique, offering corrections and encouragement in equal measure. During the lunch break, one of the senior medics approached Isolde. Sergeant Loomis, the same medic who had been at the scene the night Major Reese was injured. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by years of service, his eyes sharp and assessing. He extended his hand, and Isolde shook it. "You saved his life." "The Major? He is recovering well. Full duty in another month." Isolde nodded. "I am glad. We all are. He is a good officer, a good man. We would have lost him without you." Isolde did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded again. Sergeant Loomis studied her for a moment, then spoke more quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and understood the cost of every decision made in the field. "What you did that night, it was not just the procedure. It was the way you did it. Calm, focused, no hesitation. That is what we are trying to learn here. That is what makes the difference when everything is falling apart and you have seconds to act." Isolde met his gaze. "Then learn it by doing it, over and over, until it becomes instinct, until you do not have to think, you just act. That is the only way." Sergeant Loomis smiled faintly. "Yes, ma'am." The training session continued into the late afternoon. Isolde introduced more complex scenarios, cases where multiple casualties required simultaneous attention, where resources were scarce and time was running out. She divided the medics into teams and had them work through the scenarios in real time, calling out decisions, coordinating care, and managing the chaos that inevitably arose when everything went wrong at once. She watched them work, noting who stayed calm under pressure, who deferred to others when they should have taken charge, who hesitated when decisive action was needed. And when the exercise was complete, she provided feedback that was direct but never harsh, pointing out mistakes while acknowledging the difficulty of the task and the skill they had demonstrated in managing it. By the time Isolde finished, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the training field, visible through the windows. The medics stood and applauded, a gesture that felt both formal and deeply sincere. Several of them approached her afterward, thanking her personally, asking questions about specific techniques, and expressing hope that she would return for future sessions. Colonel Embry walked her back to her car as the base began to settle into evening routines. He thanked her for her time and asked if she would consider returning on a regular basis to train new cohorts of medics as they rotated through. Isolde agreed, and as she drove back toward town, she felt something shift inside her. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of alignment. The work she was doing, both at the hospital and here, felt right in a way that transcended recognition or validation. It felt like the work she was meant to do. Back at the hospital, word of Isolde's return and the circumstances surrounding it had spread quietly through the staff. Some nurses approached her with questions, seeking advice, or simply wanting to express their support. Others kept their distance, unsure how to navigate the change in dynamics. Dr. Gruen continued to consult her on difficult cases, his tone respectful, his deference clear. Mr. Vennick avoided her entirely, his presence in the emergency department becoming increasingly rare as the weeks passed. But the real shift was not in how others treated her. It was in how she carried herself. There was no longer any doubt about her place, no second guessing, no deference to hierarchy when patient safety was at stake. She had been fired for doing the right thing, and she had been brought back on her own terms. That knowledge was its own kind of armor, a shield against the politics and pettiness that had once threatened to derail her career. One evening, as her shift was winding down, Isolde found herself standing in the same hallway where she had been escorted out weeks earlier. The fluorescent lights still flickered, the distant beeping of monitors still filled the air. But the weight she had carried that night, the sense of injustice and humiliation, had lifted. She was no longer the nurse who had been dismissed. She was the nurse who had proven indispensable. Marin appeared beside her, holding a tablet. "There is a new admission. Trauma case, motor vehicle accident. Dr. Gruen is asking for your assessment before he makes any decisions." Isolde took the tablet and reviewed the information. Multiple injuries, internal bleeding suspected, vitals unstable. Another complex presentation. Another opportunity to make a decision that mattered. She handed the tablet back to Marin and nodded. "Let us go." They walked together toward the trauma bay, and as they moved through the controlled chaos of the emergency room, Isolde felt the rhythm settle around her like a familiar cadence. This was where she belonged, not because the system had decided it, but because the work demanded it, and she was capable of answering that demand. The weeks turned into months. Isolde continued her work at the hospital, her reputation growing not through self-promotion, but through consistent, undeniable competence. She trained more field medics, returning to the base every few weeks to work with new cohorts, refining her teaching methods based on feedback and results. She consulted on difficult cases, not just within her own hospital, but increasingly at other facilities that had heard about her expertise and sought her guidance. She quietly mentored the younger nurses who sought her out, teaching them not just technical skills, but the art of clinical judgment, the importance of trusting their instincts while remaining open to being wrong, the delicate balance between advocating for patients and working within systems that were not always designed to support that advocacy. The hospital administration never publicly acknowledged their mistake. There was no press conference, no formal apology, no statement of regret. But they did not need to. The truth was evident in every decision they deferred to her, every protocol they adjusted based on her input, every life saved because someone had finally been willing to listen. The culture of the emergency department began to shift, slowly but unmistakably. Nurses were given more authority in clinical decision-making. Patient advocacy was taken seriously rather than treated as insubordination, and the hierarchy that had once been rigid and inflexible began to soften, making room for competence and experience to outweigh titles and credentials. Major Peyton Reese returned to full duty, as Sergeant Loomis had predicted. Isolde received a formal thank you letter from him, handwritten on military letterhead, expressing gratitude not just for saving his life, but for the professionalism and skill she had demonstrated under impossible circumstances. The letter was personal and heartfelt, describing his recovery, his return to service, and the debt he felt he owed to her. She kept the letter in a drawer at home, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the work mattered beyond the walls of any single institution, that the Decisions she made had consequences that rippled outward in ways she could not always see. One evening, nearly 6 months after the night everything had changed, Isolde stood at the edge of the hospital parking lot, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of rain that had not yet fallen. Her shift had ended, and for once she was leaving on time, her responsibilities handed off to the night shift without complication. She looked back at the building, its lights glowing against the darkening sky, and thought about the path that had brought her here. She had been cast aside by people who valued compliance over competence, who prioritized hierarchy over patient safety, who could not see her worth until circumstances forced them to. And yet, she had not let their judgment define her. She had continued to do the work, to trust her training, to act with integrity even when it cost her everything. And in the end, that integrity had been vindicated not by words but by results, by lives, saved by a system that had been forced to acknowledge what it had tried to ignore. The sound of rotor blades had changed her life that night, but the truth was, she had already made the choice long before the helicopters arrived. She had chosen to save a life when it mattered, regardless of the consequences. And that choice, repeated over years and across countless patients, was what had made her indispensable. Not to the institution, which had proven itself willing to discard her, but to the people who depended on her when everything was on the line. Isolde turned and walked toward her car. The road ahead was quiet, the night still, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Not because she had been vindicated or recognized or restored to her position, but because she knew with absolute certainty that she was doing the work she was meant to do, and that no one could take that from her again. Inside the hospital, the emergency room continued its work. Monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Staff moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. Patients arrived, were treated, and were discharged or admitted. The system functioned as it always had, imperfect and overburdened, held together by the people who cared enough to do the work even when the work was hard and the recognition was scarce. And among those people, Isolde Calloway stood as a quiet reminder that worth is not granted by institutions. It is proven by the lives you save when no one else can. It is demonstrated by the decisions you make when the pressure is highest and the stakes are clearest. It is earned through years of competence, integrity, and the refusal to compromise patient safety for the sake of convenience or politics. The hospital never issued a public apology. They never held a press conference or released a statement acknowledging their error, but they did change their protocols. Patient advocacy was given more weight in clinical decision-making. Nurses were granted greater authority to question transfer decisions and challenge diagnoses when warranted. And the culture, slowly and almost imperceptibly, began to shift toward valuing competence and clinical judgment over rigid adherence to hierarchy. Isolde did not take credit for those changes. She simply continued to work, to teach, to advocate for her patients with the same quiet determination that had defined her career from the beginning. She had been dismissed as insubordinate, and she had been proven indispensable. The contrast was stark, the lesson undeniable, but she carried that lesson without pride or bitterness, simply as a fact of her experience, a reminder that systems fail and people endure. Years later, when new nurses joined the staff, they would hear the story, not from Isolde, who rarely spoke about it and never used it as a credential or a point of pride, but from the others who had been there. They would hear about the night a nurse was fired for saving a life, and how two Apache helicopters had landed in the street to bring her back. They would hear about the field procedure performed under impossible conditions, and the officer who survived because someone refused to follow protocol when protocol was wrong. And those new nurses would look at Isolde, still working her shifts with the same quiet competence, still challenging decisions when patient safety was at stake, still teaching by example rather than by lecture. And they would understand that the story was not about helicopters or drama or institutional failure. It was about the choice to act with integrity even when the cost is high. It was about trusting your training, your judgment, and your commitment to the people who depend on you. It was about refusing to let bureaucracy or hierarchy or fear dictate decisions when lives hung in the balance. Isolde Calloway never asked for recognition. She never needed validation from the people who had dismissed her. She simply continued to do the work, day after day, patient after patient, life after life. And in doing so, she became something more than an employee or a consultant or a decorated trauma specialist. She became proof that competence and courage, when held together with integrity, cannot be erased by bureaucracy or silenced by hierarchy. The emergency room lights flickered as they always had. The monitors beeped in steady rhythm. And somewhere in the controlled chaos of the night shift, Isolde moved through the work with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place not by asking for it, but by proving again and again that she was exactly where she needed to be. The worth of a person is not measured by the titles they hold or the recognition they receive. It is measured by what they do when everything is on the line and no one else can do it. Isolde understood that truth long before the helicopters came, and she carried it with her long after they left. She had been dismissed. She had been vindicated. But more than either of those things, she had simply been what she always was. A nurse who refused to let protocol dictate her conscience, who trusted her training when others doubted, and who saved lives because that was the work she had chosen to do. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The seasons changed. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. Isolde continued her routine, balancing her work at the hospital with regular training sessions at the military base. She developed relationships with the medics she trained, following their careers as they deployed and returned, sometimes receiving messages from distant locations thanking her for lessons that had saved lives in the field. Those messages were kept private, stored away in the same drawer as Major Reese's letter, reminders that the work extended beyond any single moment or decision. She also began to notice changes in herself. The anger that had burned so hot in the days following her termination had cooled into something more sustainable, a steady determination to do the work well, regardless of who was watching or what recognition might follow. She slept better, she smiled more easily, and when she walked through the hospital corridors, she did so with the confidence of someone who knew her value and did not need anyone else to confirm it. Dr. Gruen, for his part, became one of her most consistent allies. He never spoke publicly about what had happened, never made grand gestures of apology or reconciliation. But in the small daily interactions that defined their professional relationship, he demonstrated a respect that had been absent before. He consulted her early, and often, he deferred to her clinical judgment without hesitation. And when younger physicians questioned her recommendations, he supported her with the full weight of his authority. One afternoon, as they stood reviewing a particularly complex case at the nurses' station, Dr. Gruen spoke quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Isolde could hear. "I was wrong to dismiss you that night. I let ego and protocol override judgment. I have thought about it every day since." Isolde looked at him, seeing the weariness in his eyes, the weight of his own regret. "I know." He nodded slowly. "I hope you also know that what you did, both that night and the night with the military, it changed how I practice, how I think about these decisions. You made me a better doctor." Isolde held his gaze for a moment, then returned her attention to the chart in her hands. Then it was worth it. Dr. Gruen said nothing more, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested that the burden he had been carrying had lightened, if only slightly. The emergency room continued its ceaseless rhythm. Patients came and went. Lives were saved and sometimes lost. And through it all, Isolde remained a constant presence. The nurse who had been fired and vindicated, who had walked out in tears and returned on her own terms, who had proven that competence and integrity could not be dismissed no matter how hard the system tried. She had not asked for the helicopters. She had not asked for the recognition or the commendation or the consulting contract. She had simply done the work, made the right decisions, and refused to compromise when it mattered most. And because of that, she had earned something far more valuable than any title or credential. She had earned the trust of the people who depended on her, the respect of the colleagues who worked beside her, and the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The night sky above the hospital was clear, stars visible despite the glow of the city lights. Isolde stood in the parking lot, her shift complete, her responsibilities handed off, and looked up at those stars with a sense of quiet gratitude, not for what had happened to her, but for what she had learned from it. That worth is not granted but earned. That integrity matters more than approval, and that the work, in the end, is its own reward. She got into her car and drove home through streets that were familiar and comforting, past neighborhoods where lights glowed in windows and families gathered around dinner tables. And as she drove, She thought about the patients she had helped that day, the lives she had touched, the decisions she had made. Some would remember her, most would not. But that did not matter. What mattered was that she had been there, competent and steady, when they needed someone who could make the right call under pressure. That was the work. That was the calling. And Isolde Calloway, dismissed and vindicated, humiliated and honored, had proven herself worthy of it in ways that no institution could ever diminish. If you know someone whose quiet competence has made a difference that no one else could see, share this story with them. And if you believe that integrity and skill deserve to be recognized, not just in moments of crisis, but every single day, consider subscribing. Because the people who hold the world together are often the ones no one notices until everything depends on them, and their stories deserve to be told.